Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a Viking, not a character from a movie, not a costume, not a fantasy, a real person. Dark leather armor, a horned helmet, black, brutal clothing soaked in blood and mud. That image feels real, powerful, ancient, and it is almost completely false. Real Vikings did not dress to look terrifying. They did not wake up thinking about fear. They dressed to live. They dressed to work frozen soil, to survive brutal winters, to cross cold seas in open ships, to stand among others without saying a word, because clothing was not fashion, it was identity. And the truth is simple, yet uncomfortable. Vikings lived in color, not the dull browns and blacks of modern films, but reds, blues, yellows, greens, colors that carried meaning, colors that revealed wealth, status, origin. To understand Viking clothing, we must abandon the warrior fantasy and look instead at everyday life. The Viking Age was not a constant battlefield. Most Vikings were farmers, craftsmen, traders, sailors. They woke before sunrise. They worked with their hands. They lived close to weather, land, and death. And their clothing reflected this reality. Clothing was not decoration. It was protection. It was language. It told others who you were, where you came from, and how your family stood in the world. The foundation of almost all Viking clothing was wool. Wool was everywhere. Sheep were raised across Scandinavia. Wool was spun by hand, woven slowly, carefully. It was warm, durable, and most importantly, it stayed warm even when wet. For people who lived near the sea, this meant survival. Underneath wool, Vikings wore linen. Linen was made from flax, grown, harvested, spun, woven. It was lighter, softer on the skin. Shirts were linen, undergarments were linen, underdresses were linen. Producing linen took time, skill, patience. Not everyone owned much of it. Clothing was worn in layers, a base layer for comfort, a middle layer for warmth, an outer layer for protection. In winter, more wool was added. In summer, layers were reduced. There were no closets filled with choices. Most people owned only a few garments. Every piece mattered. Leather existed, but not as armor. It was used where strength and flexibility were needed. Belts, shoes, gloves, straps. Leather armor, as shown in films, is a myth. Occasionally, rare materials appeared. Silk, imported through long trade routes, sometimes from Byzantium, sometimes from the Islamic world. A single strip of silk was enough to show wealth and connection. One of the greatest myths about Vikings is that they dressed in dark, dirty colors. In reality, Viking clothing was often brightly dyed. Dyes came from nature, red from madder roots, yellow from birch leaves, blue from woad, green created by layering dyes. Dyeing fabric took time, resources, knowledge. Strong colors meant wealth. Color was power. A wealthy Viking did not hide. He stood out. Dull clothing was not style. It was poverty. Clothing also changed by region. Coastal communities favored garments that dried quickly. Inland settlements relied on heavier wool. Trade routes shaped appearance, foreign beads, new dyes, unfamiliar patterns. Fashion traveled with people. A typical Viking man wore a linen shirt and wool trousers. The trousers varied, loose, tight, practical. Leg wraps protected against cold and rough terrain. Over everything, a cloak. The cloak was essential. It blocked wind. It held warmth. It carried meaning. Cloaks were fastened with brooches, iron for ordinary people, bronze, silver, or gold for the wealthy. The brooch alone could reveal status. Clothing was extremely valuable. It took weeks, sometimes months, to create a single garment. Nothing was wasted. Clothes were repaired, patched, resized, passed down. Old garments became work clothes, then blankets, then children's clothing. Cleanliness mattered. Vikings washed. They combed their hair. They trimmed beards. Archaeology shows combs everywhere. This was not a dirty culture. And the horned helmet? It never existed in Viking warfare. No archaeological evidence supports it. The idea was invented centuries later. Viking women wore some of the most distinctive clothing of the age. Over a linen underdress, they wore an apron dress, held by shoulder straps, fastened with oval brooches. These brooches were not decoration. They held tools, knives, needles, and keys. Keys symbolized authority, control of the household, trust. Jewelry was everywhere. Neck rings, arm rings, beads, pendants. They were portable wealth. Silver could be traded, cut, melted. What you wore could save your family. Children dressed like smaller versions of adults. Their clothing taught identity early. Travel-shaped clothing. Long sea journeys demanded flexibility. Clothing had to be light enough to move, warm enough to survive, simple enough to repair. Most Vikings fought in what they wore every day. A cloak removed, a belt tightened, a helmet added. There were no uniforms. Each warrior arrived dressed as himself. There was also a clear difference between everyday clothing and special occasions. Daily life demanded practicality. Work clothes were simpler. Colors were present, but restrained. But celebrations were different. Feasts, assemblies, weddings, rituals. These moments demanded the best clothing available, the finest cloak, the brightest dyes, the most carefully chosen jewelry. Clothing was freshly washed, repaired, worn with intention. To arrive poorly dressed was not just embarrassing, it was insulting, because clothing showed respect for the host, for the community, for tradition. Clothing also communicated allegiance. Styles, colors, and jewelry signaled regional identity. Without speaking, others could tell where you came from and who you stood with. Age mattered. The young dressed simply, the old dressed with authority. Clothing aged with the person. A cloak might last decades, passed down through generations. Stitched, repaired, remembered. Garments carried memory. They witnessed births, journeys, deaths. Clothing was never just material, it was legacy. Clothing also carried meaning beyond the physical. Colors, patterns, symbols. They were believed to protect fate itself. Viking clothing was not designed to intimidate. It was designed to endure. Every thread represented labor. Every garment reflected climate, trade, and survival. The savage, black-armored Viking of modern imagination is a myth we created. The real Vikings lived in a world of color, texture, meaning. So the next time you see a Viking on screen, wrapped in leather and darkness, remember this. The truth is brighter, more human, and far more real.